Okay, welcome to FreeMind Summer School. Thank you all for attending. Appreciate it. Today's webinar's topic is Details of a Detailed Budget, Accurately Constructed and Well Justified. And today we'll be discussing some of the challenges of creating a budget. We'll talk about budget parameters and formats. We'll also offer some budget writing tips and insights. My name is Stuart Jacobowitz. I'm Director of Business Development at the FreeMind Group, and I'm delighted to be presenting today's webinar. To learn more about the FreeMind Group, you can visit our website, freemindconsultants.com. Don't forget that last S on consultants. And to keep up to date with the latest in non-dilutive funding, you can follow us on Twitter and YouTube. You could also join our LinkedIn group, Non-Dilutive Funding for Life Sciences R&D. Nice catchy name for a group. Today's webinar is the 6th in FreeMind's Group Summer School Series. And these webinars are available on YouTube on the channel called the FreeMind Group. So if you missed any of the previous webinars, no need to worry. YouTube's got it for you. And of course, today's webinar is also being recorded and will be available on YouTube. I'll be sending out the slide deck to all of you who've registered and are attending today's webinar, so feel free to share it with your friends, neighbors, colleagues, and loved ones. After today, we have 3 more webinars scheduled as part of the summer school series. We have next week on medical devices, followed by SBIR and STTR, and closing out the series we'll have on registration ins and outs. Our webinars do fill up fast, so make sure to register early and feel free to spread the word to anyone who might be interested in these webinars. Information on these webinars as well as how to register for them could be found on our website, freemindconsultants.com. At the end of the webinar, we'll have some time for Q&A. All you need to do is to ask a question is you enter your question in the question window on the side of your screen. You're also welcome to call or email me directly with questions that are specific to your situation of science, and my contact information will be available on the last slide of today's presentation. Okay, so let's get started with the show. Today's webinar, as well as this summer school series of webinars, is brought to you by the FreeMind Group. Many of you already know who we are. Maybe you've met us at a conference. We'll be at another few conferences coming up. We have, we have in September, we have the end of September, we have October, we have a full schedule coming up. So if we haven't met you yet, we'll see you then. Because we attend many conferences throughout the year or around the world. Or maybe we met you at one of our non-dilutive funding events that we host. Or possibly you've heard about us from one of your colleagues or friends. But for those of you who don't know us yet, let me begin with a very brief overview of who we are and what we do. FreeMind is a consulting firm. Actually, we're the global leader in non-dilutive funding. Our main objective is to help our clients get as much money as possible from non-dilutive sources. We work across the life sciences, and we focus on the NIH, National Institute of Health, and the DoD, Department of Defense, as well as many other government organizations such as BARDA, CDC, FDA, NSF, and others. We also work with private foundations whenever it's relevant. We have 40 full-time employees, and we're helping our clients in their quest for non-dilutive funding for almost 15 years. FreeMind files on average 250 to 300 applications on behalf of our clients every year. That's a great deal of experience, knowledge, and expertise, which is all put to work for our clients to increase their chance of winning an award, as well as to help our clients get the largest non-dilutive awards possible. Our clients include academics, research institutes, and university medical centers, as well as companies, from small startups of 1 or 2 people to medium and large companies, including many of the large pharmaceutical companies. The FreeMind Group is basically a tool. We're a tool that's here to help you maximize your non-dilutive funding potential. What does that mean? Well, first of all, our analysts identify the most relevant funding opportunities. This is a very important step. You could have a great science, however, if you apply for a grant that's not relevant to your science, or you use the incorrect mechanism, you will not be successful, despite the fact that your science is really deserving of funding. After identifying the most relevant funding opportunities, the analysts create a list of opportunities, and together with you, they create a strategy, a multi-submission granting strategy, in order to maximize the application's chances of winning an award. We also manage the complex project's production process, lead a joint application writing process, because we can't do this alone. We need you on board in this joint effort, since you're the experts in your science. And finally, when relevant, we support final contract negotiations. Now, although budgets need to be prepared when applying for grants from all institutes and agencies, such as the NSF, BARD, and the DoD, the Army, etc., there are differences between the format of the budget required in each of these agencies, and you need to carefully understand each agency's requirements. Today's webinar will be focusing on the budget format and requirements for NIH grants and grant applications. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, in the U.S., approximately $50 billion in non-dilutive capital is dedicated to funding in the life sciences every year. That's $50 billion a year. A little more than $29 billion out of that $50 billion, or close to 60%, is funding from the NIH budget. And of that $29 billion, of $29.1 billion, somewhere around $24 billion is devoted to extramural research, such as research project grants and R&D contracts. So when we say that we're focusing today's webinar on budgets included in the NIH grant applications, that covers a big piece of the non-dilutive funding pie. Okay, so buckle in, get ready, because we're talking budgets. Now, the budgets, well, some people might find that it's not so exciting. It is really one of the most important components of the application, since it describes how much money you'll need and for what purpose. It's crucial that you make sure that it's done correctly. Now, correctly means that the budget must be prepared according to the expectations of the funding agency and without raising any red flags. Now, just like each research project is unique, so too each budget is unique. No two budgets are the same. Each project has its own needs, which are dedicated by the research being proposed. Some projects consist primarily of salaries for lab personnel and standard lab materials, while others require specialized equipment, expert consultants, subcontractors, or extensive collaborations with other groups. Some of the mechanisms and solicitations impose additional limitations on the size and format of the budget and how it may be distributed. It's important to understand that the reviewers reading the application have certain expectations which are not necessarily defined by hard and fast rules. So in order to maximize the attractiveness of the budget, past experience is extremely valuable in understanding what the reviewers are looking for in a budget. In this webinar, we'll discuss some of the major challenges as well as some of the guidelines in writing a winning budget. We'll discuss the appropriate size of the budget, the required format of the budget, various components including direct and indirect costs, outsourced expenses, equipment, etc. We'll also go over the guidelines that determine which costs are allowed and which are not allowed. Now, in order to define the scope of the budget and its outline, we must first consider the mechanism and the solicitation. So let's start with the R21. This, as you probably know, is an early-stage proof-of-concept, high-risk, high-reward mechanism. Funding for the R21 is up to $275,000 in direct costs over 2 years. Notice here two very important words, direct costs. That means that indirect costs are not included in this $275,000 limit, but they are on top of or in addition to the $275,000 award. Now, we'll get into all the details and explaining the differences between direct and indirect costs, but these are terms that are extremely important that you understand, and we'll get into them shortly. For the SBIR and STTR mechanisms, the guidelines specify $150,000 in funding for Phase 1 and up to $1 million for Phase 2. Now, it's very important to understand that these amounts are not rock-solid numbers, but rather rough guidelines that describe general expectations. In fact, if your project requires it, or in other words, if you can justify it in your budget, you may exceed these costs by as much as 50%. This, in essence, means that the real upper limit for SBIR and STTR applications is actually $225,000 for Phase 1 and $1.5 million for Phase 2. These amounts include all costs in the budget, both direct and indirect costs. It's worth mentioning that these funding guidelines apply both in cases where Phase 1 and Phase 2 are submitted separately, as well as in the fast-track applications, where the two phases are submitted in a single proposal. The R01 applications, funding is up to $500,000 in direct costs in any given year, unless stated otherwise in the solicitation. One can request more than $500,000 for direct costs. However, this would require advanced approval from the institute to which the application is submitted. Requests for such budgets must be submitted well in advance, and approvals are extremely rare. So some very important lessons we learn here are, first of all, always read the solicitation carefully. Some announcements may allow more funds than are usually available for that mechanism, and some may have atypical limitations. For example, maybe a certain solicitation includes extra travel expense since you'll need to visit NIH for collaborative work. Also, when reading the solicitation, identify whether the dollar figures cited refer to annual budgets or whether they cover the entire budget award period. Note, the R21 funding is $275,000 over 2 years, with also a maximum of up to $200,000 in any 1 year, and the R01 is up to $500,000 per year. It's also important to note whether the stated funding amounts are fixed in stone or whether they're merely recommendations, as we see here with SBIR STTRs. Now keep in mind the scope of the project. If it will require a lot more in funding than a particular mechanism allows, it may be a good idea to look for another more appropriate solicitation. This, by the way, is one of the considerations when we conduct a strategic assessment. And finally, identify if the funding amount is for total costs or if it's only for direct costs, which means that there is an additional allowance for indirect costs or overhead. Something to keep in mind is that in some cases, your project may cost more than NIH is willing to fund, and you will need to find other sources of funds to cover the rest of your costs. In these cases, you must specify which sources are covering which costs. This will show that you're aware and have accounted for all the costs of the project. Now, the NIH budget comes in two formats, modular or detailed. The modular budget format is simpler and more convenient. However, it can only be used in certain cases, which you can see clearly on the flow chart before you. When deciding which budget format to use, you need to ask yourself a series of questions, and if all of the answers are yes, then you must file a modular budget. Question number one you need to ask, are my direct costs for every budget year, not in total, for every budget year, less than $250,000? If yes, kindly proceed to question number two. If no, then you have to file a detailed budget. Question number two, is the mechanism being used either in R01, R03, R15, R21, or R34? If yes, you continue on to question three. If no, you got to file a detailed budget. And finally, if you have two yeses, the third question is the applicant organization based in the USA? If yes, notice if all three questions are yes, then you must file a modular budget. If no, then you must file the detailed budget. Another way of looking at this is if in any year your direct costs are more than $250,000, you must file a detailed budget. If you're filing an SBIR or an STTR, a U01, a U19, a UH2, a U44, or anything else that is not one of the 5 mechanisms listed, again, those 5 are R01, R03, R15, R21, or R34. If it's not one of these 5, then you must file a detailed budget. And if the applicant organization is not based in the United States, you must file a detailed budget. In addition to the fact that the modular budget is easier on the applicant, it's also easier on the reviewer. With the modular budget, the total direct costs will be listed in multiples of $25,000 for up to $250,000 per year. For these sums, the NIH takes a ballpark figure approach and tries to see if the total amount that you're asking for each year makes sense. To do this, they consider the scope of your work, the personnel you're employing, and the subcontracted costs you need to provide a personnel justification, which is a summary of the personnel involved as well as their time contribution to the project. If relevant, they'll also ask for a consortium justification, which shows the subcontracts and consortium partners that you're employing and what they'll be responsible for. And in cases where annual costs differ between the budget years, you'll also have to provide an additional narrative justification which explains the differences. Here you can see an example of what a modular budget looks like. As you can see, all you need are your own total direct and indirect costs, as well as your consortium partners' indirect costs if you have a consortium partner. I'll expand on the distinction between total direct and indirect costs shortly. This modular budget must be completed for each of the budget years. The second budget format is the detailed budget. As its name implies, it's much more detailed than the modular budget. It requires more work than a modular budget, and it includes a breakdown of all the costs by category and subcategory. A detailed budget justification must be provided, which names each of the costs, explains what they're needed for, and how you arrived at the dollar amount that you're requesting for each item. Here you can see a sample of the first page of the 3-page detailed budget. A detailed budget needs to be completed for each and every budget year. In detailed budgets, you must name each person on the project and how much time they're contributing. Time contribution here is defined by calendar months or academic months, as opposed to by hours. This information is also required in the personnel justification of a modular budget. However, here in a detailed budget, you actually need to state how much money you're giving each of them as a function of their annual salary, as well as fringe benefits, which must also be taken into account. Be aware that the budget cap for senior personnel is updated each year and currently stands at just over $180,000 per year, or $181,500 to be precise. Note that the personnel category of your budget should include only personnel from the organization whose budget is described. Personnel from other institutions, be they consultants or collaborators from another laboratory, should appear under the consultant's cost item or within the collaborator's sub-award budget, which I'll discuss a bit later. The second page of the budget, which you see here, is where you include some additional costs. As you can see, the form has places for many different kinds of costs, such as equipment, travel, participant, trainee support costs, and more. You do not have to fill in every line. Only some of these costs may be relevant to any given grant. Notice that in this example, there are no costs requested for equipment. Again, I'll expand on this more shortly. The third page, the final page of the detailed budget, as you see here, has still more direct cost categories, as well as the total direct costs. It also has the details of indirect costs for the applicant and his or her consortium partners, same as is done in the modular budget. This is also where you attach the budget justification, where all the costs that you're listing and requesting are broken down and explained. Remember, a detailed budget must be completed for each and every budget year. So let's take a moment to discuss some of the costs and some of the cost categories. Equipment is generally defined as an item of property that has a cost of $5,000 or more, along with an expected service life of more than a year. This is as opposed to materials and supplies, which tend to be disposable. The NIH sees its role as funding specific research and not funding the setting up of laboratories. They usually do not look kindly upon funding equipment, as they expect you to already have all the equipment that you need. If you ask for standard laboratory equipment, be it a small item like a desktop centrifuge or personal computer, or a large piece of equipment such as an HPLC or an electron microscope, the NIH will suspect that this equipment will serve many other uses in addition to the project you're proposing. They'll see this as an attempt to set up a laboratory with new equipment using NIH funds, which is generally against NIH policy. That being said, the NIH may make exceptions in cases where the pieces of equipment requested are very specific for the project being proposed. For example, if you need to have an item custom made to the specifications of the project, or if a certain item has no other uses other than for the proposed application. If you do ask for equipment, it should be very well justified. Explain why this project needs this particular piece of equipment and how it will be used exclusively for the proposed work. Many companies or laboratories are not entirely self-sufficient for a particular project and cannot perform all the proposed work on their own. Alternatively, they may find it more efficient or beneficial to either contract out some of the work or to partner with collaborators. These collaborators may have more suitable facilities, or they may be more familiar with certain aspects of the research techniques or models being proposed. In these cases, some of the budget will be outsourced. There are three kinds of outside contributors that are recognized: consultants, subcontractors, and a consortium. In some cases, some of your research may cover areas that are new to you, or perhaps you'd like to consult with an expert in the field. This expert will help you with the study design, advise on the use of certain models or techniques, or assist you in interpreting the results. A consultant will be someone from outside your institution who contributes to the project intellectually but does not actually do any of the wet lab work, nor does he or she contribute physical resources. This person will generally be paid as a function of their salary and the percent contribution, or at a fixed hourly or daily rate. Another kind of contributor is a subcontractor. This is usually a commercial company that offers specific services for a fee. For example, you may turn to a company to sequence proteins or nucleic acids, produce antibodies, conduct toxicity studies on animals, or analyze biological specimens taken from human subjects. Such subcontractors usually do not contribute intellectually to the study design. You give them A, for example, samples to be analyzed or a compound to be tested or manipulated, and they give you B, the data that they acquired from your samples or the product that they produced according to your specifications. Their costs are generally quoted according to a rate that they define or that you negotiate with them, and will include their commercial considerations, although these will not be specified in the budget. The most substantial contribution is usually by a consortium partner. This constitutes a collaboration or partnership between the applicant and another entity and usually contributes to the research interests of both entities. The consortium partner will provide personnel to carry out a portion of the work at their own facilities or at facilities to which they have access. They may be in charge of specific tasks, or they may even share in the responsibility for the entire project, as in the case when there are multiple PIs, one from the applicant organization and the other from the consortium partner. Whenever there is a consortium, the partners should provide their own budget, which you'll include as a sub-award budget. A sub-award budget looks just like the applicant's budget. Unlike the subcontractor's costs, which has fixed or negotiated price quotes for specific services, this sub-award is composed of the sum of the costs of the research for which the consortium partner will be responsible. It consists of salaries for the personnel involved in accordance with their time contribution, the costs of the materials that will be needed, and all the other costs that go into performing the research. Their indirect costs will also be listed according to their own negotiated rate. Knowing in which category your outsourced costs fall and what you need from them in terms of sub-award budgets, resources, biosketches, and letters of support takes experience and should be done with great care. Let's take a moment to understand the difference between direct and indirect costs. I used the terms a few times, and it's really very important to understand this. The distinction between these costs will help you understand which costs are allowable and which are not. Let's start with direct costs. Direct costs are those costs that are directly associated with the tasks you're proposing in your application. Direct costs include the personnel who will be working to perform or oversee the tasks described, includes the materials, supplies, and animals that will be used for the experiments. It includes subcontractors hired to perform certain tasks, equipment that will be needed, travel to sites to coordinate the work and inspect the progress, as well as other direct costs. Then there are indirect costs. These are also required to maintain the research environment. However, they're not associated with any particular research project. These may include administrative costs such as CEOs, CFOs, secretarial and accounting services, renting facilities, maintaining the equipment, utility bills, etc. Indirect costs, also sometimes referred to as overhead, may be defined and is sometimes referred to as F&A, facilities and administrative costs, or G&A, general and administrative costs, depending on what they include. These indirect or overhead costs will be incurred by the company regardless of the research being conducted and are a function of the sum of all research being conducted. After all, more research may mean more maintenance of the equipment, more personnel, or more human resource management. It may also require expansion of the laboratory or more electricity. Therefore, the NIH pays for indirect costs as a percentage of the direct costs to cover its share in the load on the research environment. However, these costs are not broken down or detailed. You do not list what the indirect costs include. Knowing which costs you may request as direct costs and which are not acceptable and are expected to be covered by the indirect costs is another area where valuable experience is extremely important and extremely helpful in a successful budget. So, how do we budget for indirect costs? It's calculated as a percentage of the indirect cost base. The percentage is either negotiated with the HHS or another government agency, or you write a provisional rate which serves as the basis of the negotiation prior to the award. When negotiating, they'll take into account your organization's administrative needs and the research support that's offered. For companies, this figure tends to be between 20 and 40%. On the other hand, foreign applicants are limited to indirect cost rate of 8%. The indirect cost base is based on the total direct costs less certain exclusions. Equipment, for example, is excluded in the indirect cost base. Also, outsourced costs are excluded as they're not subject to your administration. You may only include the first $25,000 of your outsourced costs in the indirect cost base. In some cases, the negotiated agreement between the government and your institution may impose additional limitations on what you may or may not include in the indirect cost base. So the indirect costs are actually the product of the indirect cost rate and a value called the indirect cost base. Note also that in many cases where the solicitation or mechanism limits your budget, this restriction may only apply to the direct costs. As such, you may want to separate your collaborators' costs into direct and indirect costs, if they're willing to do so, which may enable you to include more costs in your budget. Okay, so we've discussed the budget framework and structure, but what about the content? I'd like to give you some tips on how to approach the writing process. First of all, make sure to build the budget from the bottom up. What does that mean? Bottom up means that you should define each cost that you'll need and see how they all add up. Do not define ahead of time what the total budget will be and then distribute it to the various cost categories. Also, be complete, but be concise. All the costs should be explained. It should be made clear what each item is needed for, in what budget year you'll need that money, and how you arrived at the amount you're requesting. You should be thorough enough to convince the reviewers that you have a good sense of the costs of each of the items and that everything is accounted for. Make sure also that you're realistic and that the costs you cite reflect true market values. You should consider the full spectrum of costs that your research will require. Investigate ahead of time what the various items cost, for example, reagent costs or travel expenses, and get a good assessment of what you need. Ask for what you need. No more, no less. If you try to request more than you need, you may appear greedy, as if you're trying to take advantage of the NIH budgets for other purposes. On the other hand, do not under-budget your application. Some researchers believe that if they ask for less money, their application will look more attractive. This is not the case. Applications are granted according to the scientific merit. If you ask for less money, the reviewers might get the impression that you're not aware of the costs, or you don't understand what's necessary to complete the research, or that you will not be able to complete the research with the funds you requested. However, if you find that you're exceeding the limits, make sure to write the costs anyway. Also state where you'll get the money to cover these costs. Do not simply omit them. If you leave them out, it'll appear as though there is something missing and you haven't taken into account. In completing the detailed budget, make sure to read solicitations carefully. Solicitations sometimes introduce additional costs that they require you to include. For example, in cooperative agreements, they may request that you budget an annual trip to the PI for the PI to travel to the NIH to present your findings and coordinate with other PIs on the program. Ultimately, your budget will be judged based on 4 criteria. Reasonableness. Make sure that what you're asking for meets your needs without going overboard, and that the costs that you cite reflect the market value for those limits. As I mentioned, you do not want to be excessive, but you also do not want to underestimate your needs such that you will not be able to meet your goals with the amount you requested. Allocatability. Make sure that the costs you're requesting are really going for what you say they are. Don't try to hide costs which are not allowable in other places. Consistency. Make sure you know which costs should be charged as direct costs and which are expected to be covered by your institution as indirect costs. This should be consistent throughout the application and, in fact, in all your applications. And fourth and final criteria which your budget will be judged is conformance. Your budget needs to conform to the regulations of the funding agency. For example, salary caps must be in line with the funding agency's regulations. The inclusion and exclusion of costs from the indirect cost base and which items may be requested in the first place must also conform with the funding agency's regulation. As I mentioned before, and I'm repeating it because it's so important, read the solicitation. If you do not carefully read the solicitation, you may not know of budget limitations in terms of direct and indirect costs. You may not be aware of additional limitations or requirements. You may not get as much money as possible from the solicitation, and there's a good chance that you'll be leaving money on the table. And if you don't read the solicitation, you may incorrectly prepare the budget, and as a result, your application may be rejected. Knowledge of the system and experience. That's the difference between an attractive, realistic, and justifiable budget which has a good chance of success and an incorrectly prepared, messy, and unrealistic budget which could significantly harm the chance of award. Okay, so we know the criteria which will be used to judge a good budget. Now let's take a moment to look at the NIH Review Process to see how they'll judge a grant application. When reviewing and considering whether to fund your application, they weigh the strengths versus the risks. The way they do this is by first looking at 2 things, responsiveness and competitiveness. Are you responsive to the solicitation? Because no matter how good your science is, if you're not responsive to solicitation, you will not be awarded. And are you competitive? When we talk about competitiveness, they basically look at 5 criteria, and they score you on these 5 criteria. First of all, the significance of your research to public health. Is it significant? How significant is it? Is it innovative? Are you going to really make a change with your approach? They look at the leadership. Do you have the right leadership in place? Does the PI and the key personnel have the expertise and experience to successfully lead such a project? The environment. Can it support the work you propose? For example, do you have the proper lab space for the work you'll do? But ultimately, what makes the difference between a good application that isn't awarded and one that is awarded is your scientific approach, the milestones, the specific goals. Ultimately, top-notch scientific approach is what wins awards. Now, for a more broad perspective, I'd like to take a step back and give you an idea of our approach to non-dilutive funding and how to maximize your chance for award. First of all, you need to know the interest of the institute. What's on their agenda? What are they looking to fund? What will not get funded because it's not within the scope or was within the scope in previous years? If necessary, communicate with the program officers. This is extremely important. You need to focus your project application. Focused applications have a higher chance of being favorably reviewed. Remember, the NIH doesn't fund companies or labs. They fund projects. You don't want your proposal to come across to reviewers as overly ambitious or unrealistic. Make sure to ask for what's necessary. Don't inflate the budgets or ask for too little. Having an accurate budget shows that you're realistic and you understand your project. Make sure to present a complete project. Have one comprehensive storyline. And leverage on research collaborations. Whether or not the mechanism requires it, or in a case where there's a gap in your capabilities, it's important to collaborate. Take on consultants, statisticians, or outsource your work you're less proficient at and don't have the expertise to complete. In an effort to maximize your chance to win an award and to win the largest possible award, I don't think I can overestimate the importance of targeting the right mechanism. It's very important to know your way around the various mechanisms. They're a lot more than just a bunch of letters and numbers. They represent the requirements of the solicitation, the nature of the project, budgetary factors, cooperation for the NIH, and much more. There are many different pockets of money, and you really need to target what's right for your project. It's vital to understand the different sides of award and success rates. Know the different funding levels and match them to your requirements. And of course, conduct a thorough strategic assessment. What are your objectives? What research do you have, and what stages of development are they? What would you like your research to be in the next 12, 24 months? And what is the potential for success for each of your research projects? And all this should be done with the goal of creating a multi-submission granting strategy. The more shots on goal or at-bats you choose, whatever sport you prefer, the better your chance of success. I'd like to conclude with a little bit about FreeMind team. We currently have 40 full-time employees, including scientific analysts and grant consultants, who are dedicated to providing clients with the best strategy for targeting non-dilutive funding opportunities, as well as the best execution of these strategies. All analysts and managers have a great deal of experience and expertise, which is channeled into your application in order that is the most complete, best written, and highest quality application that can be submitted. And on a personal level, they're all really nice people, which makes working together with them effective, efficient, and enjoyable. To summarize what we do, we offer two core services. First, we conduct a strategic assessment. Our analysts begin by understanding your specific science, where you are now and where you'd like to be in the next 12 to 24 months. Then, based on a series of conference calls as well as information you supply us with, our analysts come up with a list of opportunities which is used in creating the multi-submission granting strategy. It is very important to understand that specific solicitations typically account for only 30% of awards. The remaining 70% are unsolicited or investigator-initiated. In order to properly file for one of these omnibus or unsolicited awards, our analysts engage program officers to get their feedback. We could learn, for example, that aims 1, 2, and 3 are very much within the scope, whereas aims 4 and 5 are not, and how it would be best to focus your application. The strategic assessment is an ongoing process taking place year-round. Funding opportunities present themselves literally every day, and when an opportunity emerges that meets your requirements, we will present it to you and see how best to incorporate it into the strategic plan. Once we have this multi-submission granting strategy in place, the grant consultants join the picture, and in order to work with you and manage the grant writing process. This is a joint effort. We can't do it without you. We manage the process, we create comprehensive templates based on solicitation guidelines, and fill in as much information as we can, but it's your science and you know it best. The ongoing feedback process, or ping pong process, again, you choose the sport, tennis, ping pong, volleyball, with you answering questions, filling in missing information, and us converging the information in writing and rewriting parts, organizing budgets, etc. is what goes into filing the highest quality application with the best chance of success. And here we see a schematic view of the process and the joint effort. You start with your R&D funding needs. Then based on that, we create a multi-submission granting strategy, first with a long-term view and then focusing in on the short term. We then get into the grant writing and application submission phase, followed by review and funding, hopefully. The process continues from there for more funding on to the next project and more funding. We keep looking for more funding opportunities, filing more applications, you receive more awards, and on and on. And everyone lives happily ever after. And with that, we've come to the end of today's webinar presentation. Thank you very much for attending. I hope you found it interesting and educational. If you have any questions on the subject, what was discussed today, I'm happy to answer them now, or as much as time allows. If you have questions which are about your project or science, I'd be happy to answer them as well. However, I think it would be best if you email me the questions so we could arrange a time to speak. If I don't get to answer your question today, please feel free to contact me directly. Let's see, we have some questions here. Okay, someone asked if the webinar will be recorded and distributed. Yes, as I mentioned, it is being recorded. I did remember to push the record button, and I will be sending out an email with a link to the recording as well as the slide deck to all of you who've registered and are participating in this webinar. Okay, someone's asking, do you also provide service to help with looking for partners in a consortium? That's not really in our scope. That's not really in the focus of what we do. We do know a lot of different companies, a lot of different players. Possibly we might know someone, but that's not really the scope of what we do, of our business model. And speaking of business model, I see we have a question here on what is FreeMind's business model. Okay, it's a good question. We work on a success-oriented model, which means that when you win an award, we then get paid. Our usual award percentage is 6%. And then on top of that, in order to cover our costs, we usually charge a retainer fee. Retainer fees usually start at around $4,000 a month over an 8-month period. We work on an 8-month period so that we can cover at least 2 major NIH deadlines as well as many other deadlines for different other organizations and institutes. But the prices do vary slightly. The retainer varies slightly based on the number of projects that you have and the pipeline and various other factors. And I'll be happy to speak to you individually to understand your science, understand your company, and see what's appropriate and what we could do for you. Let's see. Okay, someone's asking, refer to the budget year. Is this the company's fiscal year or the NIH year? That's a good question. I'm pretty sure it goes by your year. However, if you wouldn't mind sending me an email with that question, I will double check it for you and get back to you just to confirm that that I am in fact correct. Okay. Then someone is asking, someone says that this seems a little complicated and confusing, this whole budget process, and if we recommend legal assistance or otherwise. It is, yes, you're right. It is in fact a complicated process. It can be confusing, and it's important that it be done correctly. However, there are companies that do it on their own, and they are successful. And there are many companies who do come to professionals and get professional assistance in preparing the budget as well as the entire application. I think that's all the time we have now, and I apologize if I didn't get to your question, but again, please contact me directly at my email, stewart@freemindconsultants.com. In closing, I want to let you know that we've looked at some of the websites of some of you who've registered here, and some seem like there's some very interesting science which also seems to have a lot of potential. So I look forward to being in touch with you in the coming days, week or so, and we'll see if there's something we can do to help you. Also remember, as I said, this webinar is available on YouTube, and look out on your email. I'll be sending you the slide deck as well as the link to the YouTube. And finally, make sure to register for next week's budget on devices. It should be quite interesting, quite fascinating. And I think that's it for today. So I thank you all for attending. I wish you a great day, and we look forward to seeing you back next week. And I look forward to speaking to many of you, most of you, on the phone in the near future. Thank you very much, and have a good day.